where we left off were the actual parts of the neuron. Okay? Today, we're going to take that and kind of build up to how neurons communicate with each other. So, in other words, I'm referring to this as neurons, neuropathways, and neurotransmitters. So all things neuron today. And like I mentioned, your body and your brain are your experience of the world, right? So yesterday we very briefly touched on this idea that your brain is stuck inside of this membrane. It's in cerebral fluid, and it's inside of this like membrane that's called the dura. And the dura keeps all of that fluid inside the brain. So all of these loose ions that are floating around, all of the molecules that your brain releases, all of the fluid that brings nutrients, the blood that flows through there in the temporal artery, your brain is inside and encased in a protected environment. But it's even deeper than that, right? So if your brain has to get a message to your body, say to like walk across the street, that's an impulse. It is a charge that fires on a network in your brain. But that impulse has to get from the place where it originates, your conscious awareness, to, in this case, your legs and your arms. So if we just start with the big picture situation here, how is it that your brain gets a message to the body? Well, your brain, you don't have to verbally say, right leg forward, too far. Left leg forward. Turn to the right 12 degrees. You're not RoboCop. So how your brain communicates with your body is an internal feedback loop. Right? Write down the phrase feedback loop, because that's important. When your brain realizes or makes a decision, then what it has to do is get that message to a location in the body. And it does that via nerves in your tissue. So yesterday we talked about sensory neurons and motor neurons and interneurons. Well, those are the nervous systems of the body. The sensory neurons and the motor neurons are what's known as the peripheral nervous system. It's everything that's not your brain and spine. And what it does is it takes in data. It takes in, oh, well, a fly landed on my arm, or the temperature is cold, or ow, that guy slapped me. That's the messages that are coming from your skin cells to the brain. It's a peripheral nervous system. But you also have an internal homeostasis chemical system. That's the soft organs of your body. That's the tissue of your body. Those are the hormones that get created and secreted into the bloodstream. That's known as the autonomic nervous system. So there's a network of nerves that communicate via the bloodstream to your brain. So if your brain has to get a message to, say, your pancreas, how does it do it? Well, it has to put a chemical into the bloodstream as the blood is passing through the brain, and then that chemical travels through the vascular system until it lands on wherever it is that it causes a reaction. And that's how your brain and body communicate with itself. So for instance, you think of things like the limbic system. There's a part of your limbic system called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, H for hypothalamus, H for homeostasis. The hypothalamus is really a fun part of your brain. Because what it does is it looks at the chemicals that are in your bloodstream as the blood flows through the temporal artery. The hypothalamus is evaluating what chemicals are at the right level and what chemicals are at the wrong level. And as it determines what's missing, it causes a communication feedback. So the hypothalamus decides, we need some more adrenaline. So we got to send a message, which is norepinephrine, to the adrenal gland so it can secrete epinephrine and we can have an adrenaline spike. It's not like the brain tells your mouth to yell down to your gut, hey, we're about to get in a fight. How about a little heart rate up here, right? It's not how it works. The brain has to put a message into the bloodstream so that it can flow to an organ. It causes a reaction. The organ secretes a hormone, and now it's having a physiological effect on the body. Yes?
Is it like maintaining homeostasis?
Yes. And that's how homeostasis happens. Because what if it's not adrenaline? What if it's hunger? How does your brain know that you need to eat? Well, there are nutrients missing from the bloodstream. So as the bloodstream flows through the hypothalamus, it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We're missing key nutrition here. Make that guy eat. So what it does is it puts a chemical message into the bloodstream which affects your stomach in a physiological way. It makes it gurgle and growl. And you're like, oh, I'm hungry, Chick-fil-A. And you're being controlled by your brain. That's what's happening. Your brain has incentivized you to eat because you know from past experience that when I put Chick-fil-A sandwich in my mouth, I get full. But how do I get full? How does your brain know how much Chick-fil-A sandwich is in your stomach? Because as that the nutrients in your bloodstream get to the brain, it realizes, okay, now we're good. And so it sends a counteractor, all right, stop. Make her stop eating. Please stop, right? So if you eat fast enough, you can get full before your brain realizes how much food is in your stomach, and then that's a bad decision. But you can fool it, right? So the reverse to that psychology is if you want to eat less, eat slower, because your bloodstream is going to get back to the brain and it's going to realize, oh, we have enough nutrients, we can stop eating now. It's the feedback loop between your brain and your body. Yes?
Yesterday you were saying that like hormones and stuff go through your body a lot slower than
Neuro impulses in your brain?
But what about epinephrine? Because when you get scared, it won't stop immediately just as fast as
Yes.
you were getting.
So here's the beautiful thing about fight or flight. Inside of your peripheral nervous system, you have two systems. You have the system that ramps you up. That's called the sympathetic nervous system. And then you have the system that calms you down when you've burned enough energy and the threat is gone. So this question is a good one. Why is that instantaneous, right? So if it requires no conscious thought, it's a subconscious thing. So let's say like I threw a rock at your head. Well, your brain wouldn't process, well, it's traveling at this rate of speed, at this plane and trajectory, and so, right, and then it just hits you. Because the rock is traveling faster than an impulse, right? It is. We mentioned the baseball example. A 90-mile-an-hour fastball is traveling faster than an impulse in your brain. The impulse in your brain is pretty slow. So it's actually not possible for you to process it fast enough. So what does your brain do? It reacts. It guesses. So here's an interesting way to answer that. Without realizing it, all the stimuli that comes from your 4 of your 5 senses goes through the amygdala of the human brain. And the amygdala is responsible, it's part of the limbic system that's responsible for fear and aggression. So anything that's fear related or anything, so blind rage, sexual aggression, right? Athletic competition, that aggression that you get, you think testosterone, what it is an amygdala response. So your brain can actually make an executive decision in the central nervous system before you're even consciously aware that it happens. And if you don't believe me, tell someone to throw something at your face at any random time throughout the day. You'll probably duck. So a complex message has come from the brain. We have visual data, incoming, incoming, incoming. Tell the body to move, bend the knees, drop, right? You might even reach your hand out and catch it. It's all a reaction. It's a reflex. In other words, it's not conscious. It's something that you did unconsciously. And that's because you can do things in a fit of rage before you even realize what you've done. That's that animalistic, this hot, cold empathy gap where we can't really accurately predict what we're capable of doing because at our essence, we're really animals. So if someone attacks you, you may shrink down and hide in fear or run away, or you might try to kill them. It's just hard to predict what you would do. It's whatever your amygdala decides, right? If you're being attacked and you're being victimized, you might actually just choke somebody out. And you might surprise yourself and be like, well, that was dumb. I probably shouldn't have done that. That guy had a knife. But you might. It's not logical. If you used logic for everything, it would not be evolutionarily sound. So there are rage responses that you have that you can't predict. And they kind of scare you. And even Freud talked about that. The subconscious urges that you don't know that you're capable of, they just kind of come out, right? The real explanation for that was his question, is that the amygdala will make an executive decision before you're even consciously aware of a threat, right? So somebody swings at you and you hit them. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Well, yeah, you did. You just didn't realize that you were going to do it. You meant to because your brain made you, right? So there are things automatically that your brain does, that he's right, that are much faster than the speed of a typical impulse. And they're definitely faster than the speed of a hormone, right? If I've got to defend myself in an attack and I got to wait for adrenaline to get all the way through my tissues, that's a problem. That's why your heart rate increases, though, so it can go faster. Now, so let's say adrenaline spikes and your heart rate has increased and now you have adrenaline coursing through your veins, and you're like all jacked up, like you just hit yourself with an EpiPen. Well, the problem is it takes a long time for that to wear off, right? Because the adrenaline doesn't dissipate, it gets metabolized. So we talked about yesterday. What happens is your gut begins to metabolize these hormones and they leave the body as waste. But how does it know when to do that? That's the counteractor of the sympathetic nerves, right? The sympathetic nerves are the parasympathetic nerves. It's an alternative message from the brain that tells your organs and tissues to stop producing their chemicals. And eventually, they will get metabolized. But if your adrenal gland kept producing adrenaline, eventually you would burn out all of your energy reserves and potentially die. So it's not a good thing for you to be on an adrenaline spike for days at a time. That's a problem, right? And they've done those studies with like soldiers in combat and stuff like that. They're like awake for 3 days on adrenaline with fight or flight, and they're just not logical people. They're animalistic. So your brain, again, to her point, is homeostasis. Your brain has to constantly counteract what's an appropriate chemical and when. The reason why I'm telling you about the bloodstream for neurons is this. Not only is your brain inside of the dura, your brain has these cells, these different endothelial cells that are in the lining of the membrane, but there's also these little like feet, and I'll show you the diagram tomorrow. They're called astrocytes. So you have these astrocytic feet that they protect the artery that runs through your brain. And by protecting the artery, basically they've created this barrier, this protective coating over the artery that we call the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is what prevents the things that are in your brain, these molecules that we're going to talk about, from getting into the bloodstream and being metabolized. So all of the, the like alphabet song that you learned in kindergarten would be metabolized and you would pee it out. That would be a problem, right? Or we mentioned that blood is constantly being regenerated and things like that. If your body was filtering out all of your thoughts and knowledge and hopes and dreams, well, that would be problematic. You get cut and bleed out all of your memories from second grade, that would be an issue. So those things stay inside your brain because they can't enter the bloodstream. So your brain is protected from toxins in the bloodstream. We talked about that yesterday. But that's a problem in some ways because how is it your brain is supposed to get a message to the body if it can only put things into the blood and the bloodstream is protected by those astrocytic feet? Well, there is a part of your limbic system that is not protected by the blood-brain barrier. So this is the part of your brain that communicates with the body. It's probably the most important gland that you have in your endocrine system. It starts with a P. It is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the part of your limbic system that puts hormones directly into the bloodstream that will get to the body. Your hypothalamus is safely tucked away and protected. Your pituitary gland is not. And the downside to that is the pituitary gland has access to the blood, but it also conversely means that the blood has access to the pituitary gland. So if you eat or ingest something that can affect your pituitary gland, it will, because there's nothing protecting it from toxins in the bloodstream, right? So the pituitary gland is vulnerable, but it's accessible to the bloodstream, right? It's a give and take. So when you think about the macro, the bigger picture here, it's really fascinating how the brain communicates with the body and vice versa. It's constantly checking the chemistry of your blood. And that's how it determines that one chemical needs to be reduced or one chemical needs to be added. And that's what your limbic system does. That's what emotional responses are. When you become happy, we know it's because serotonin is being released. But what determines when serotonin gets released? Well, now we get into action potentials. Yes?
For the pituitary gland, it puts a hormone in the bloodstream to get to the body.
Yeah. So basically, the brain's way to send messages, like the pituitary gland is like the Amazon Prime for the brain. Like the brain's like, can you take this to the liver, please? I got you, bro. Well, she's sitting down. It's going to take 15 minutes. All right, I'll wait. I'm good. It's like a dog's chasing you. I can be there in 30 seconds, right? It just depends on how fast your circular system is going. Your vascular system is circulating blood. So it's really it's not that complex. It's really kind of a fascinating process. So whatever chemicals are in your blood. So you drink a bunch of caffeine, it affects your brain, but it also affects your body. It affects the physiology of your tissues, right? So that's the various nervous systems. And the neurons just communicate electrochemically. Whereas the hormones, as he said, they have to cycle through your blood and they have to get to their locations. And that's the problem with hormones, is they travel really slowly at whatever the rate of circulation of your bloodstream, right? So yesterday I mentioned the term electrochemical. So if you weren't here yesterday, write that down. Electrochemical. So if your body communicates chemically, the chemical in the bloodstream circulates. Your brain and your other nerves communicate in a way that's electrochemical. They are still releasing molecules, but they're not releasing them into the blood. They're releasing them into synapses so that other neurons can catch them. And it's electrochemical because what causes the chemicals to be released is an electrical charge. So yesterday you heard me use the analogy of static electricity. Well, that's what's going to cause neurons to fire. So if we go backwards to go forwards, we look at a neuron, right? And the neuron has all of these dendrites on it. And what happens is these dendrites, like the roots of a tree, that's the analogy we use, they're there to catch the molecules that are floating around. Those molecules have been released by one neuron, and they land on receptor sites, which are the dendrites of another neuron. And if we get enough positive ions added to this neuron, it's going to change the polarization of the neuron itself. And just like any other system in your body, just like homeostasis in your bloodstream, the brain is always trying to repolarize itself. So when the polarization is out of balance, you get a thought, you get a memory, you get a release of serotonin or of dopamine. In other words, what causes your brain to function, what causes neurons to fire, we call it an action potential. So what causes a neural impulse is this depolarization. This is how it actually works. Random ionic charges floating around in the fluid of your brain. So what happens when a molecule gets released? It lands on a receptor site. And we mentioned that every neuron is a one-way pathway and it has a specific purpose. So if we're talking about a pathway that's, say, a serotonin pathway, which is mood, right? So serotonin molecules are going to be created, stored, and released by a single neuron. So those molecules are not going to travel from neuron to neuron to neuron. It's not like you have 37 serotonin molecules and they circulate in a big circle. No. Every neuron in the link of your serotonic system produces, stores, and releases its own molecules of serotonin. So what happens then is this. You get an ion change. You get a polarization change. So when we talk about action potentials, what that means is that there is a pathway in your brain that is ready to fire. And all it needs is a static charge. So think about this. Positively versus negatively charged ions bouncing around in the spaces of your brain. When the polarization changes in a neuron, it's going to repolarize itself. So how does it repolarize? It does so by releasing positive ions. That's known as selective permeability. So basically when a neuron fires, it's because it's releasing ions. It's caused a static chain. After it fires, it's in a resting state. So once you have a thought, there's a period of time before you can have that pathway fire again. It's called a refractory period, right? So the action potential is actually the fact that a pathway in your brain is primed and ready to fire. So you go to math class and you're ready to access math information that you've learned in the past. Well, the neurons in that pathway have to be ready to fire. So ions in, ions out. So as the dendrites collect these molecules, it changes the polarization of this neuron. And it wants to repolarize itself. So what does it do? It opens up and it starts releasing the excess ions. And now that it's open, look what happens. It's a chain reaction. Okay? What happens is that the polarization travels down the axon. It reaches the end of the axon where the terminals are. And that charge causes those terminals to release their molecules into the spaces. And then the process repeats itself, right? So when you see things like negative charges and positive charges, that's what we're referring to. The fact that it's actually static that causes a neuron to fire. I mean, metaphorically speaking, right? So there's a term that I got to teach you there. There are molecules in your brain that will cause neurons to fire. We call them excitatory neurotransmitters. And there are molecules in your brain that actually will prevent neurons from firing. And those are inhibitory molecules. right? So for instance, an inhibitory molecule might be something like GABA. GABA is a molecule, it's an acronym for a really long scientific chemical term. What GABA does is it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter that prevents glutamate from being released. Glutamate in your brain is what causes this process. Glutamate is how your brain functions. So glutamate is what makes neurons fire. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter molecule that causes you to think about things. So when you have too much glutamate and you're thinking too much, you get overstimulation of the brain. And it's painful. What do we call that? It begins with an M. We call that a migraine. A migraine is actually physiologically explained as excess glutamate in the brain causing too many pathways to fire at one time. On a more long-term scale, it's not a migraine. It's called anxiety. So sometimes just by changing your diet and decreasing the amount of gluten that you eat, you're decreasing the amount of glutamate that's in the synapses of your brain, and you're actually slowing your brain down to a healthier level. So some neurosurgeons, or not surgeons, but some neurologists will tell you if you're dealing with anxiety and migraines, the first thing that you can try before you get to medication, cut some gluten out of your diet and see if you're not just inundating your brain with glutamate and all of your neurons are firing, you're overstimulated, right? And that's good advice, right? It's synthetic glutamate. So your brain realizes, I have too much glutamate. I'm doing too much. So the release of GABA. GABA is a molecule that blocks glutamate. So we have excitatory neurotransmitters and we have inhibitory neurotransmitters. And so it either does one of two things. A molecule in your brain either causes a neuron to fire or it prevents a neuron from firing. It either excites or it inhibits. Yes? Yes. Excite in a literal term. It was resting and now it's doing something. Right? So if it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, that means it causes a neuron to fire in your brain. Yes?
What's the difference between like a molecule and a
A
neuron?
neuron is the cell itself. The molecules are what the cell holds and releases.
So like serotonin would be the
Serotonin is the molecule. The neuron is the tissue of the brain.
So every molecule creates stores and releases.
Every neuron creates, stores, and releases molecules. Neurotransmitters is what we call them. They're not hormones because in order for a chemical to be considered a hormone, it has to be exclusively in your bloodstream. Bloodstream molecules are called hormones. Brain molecules are called neurotransmitters. They are both molecular. They are both tiny. The difference is where are they traveling. Hormones live in your blood. Neurotransmitters live in your neurons. So these molecules are being manufactured, stored, released, and received by neurons. Neurons connect together to make a pathway. And you have millions and millions and millions of pathways just crisscrossing each other throughout your brain, like your dopamine pathways and your serotonin pathways and your long-term memories and your, excitement and your, sight pathways, and they're all high-fiving each other. Hey, Bob. Hey, Tom. Hey, dopamine. Hey, serotonin. Hey, endorphins. Just crisscrossing pathways in your brain. So let's look at the process as a whole. Now that we've seen what a neuron consists of, let's look how it communicates. So we have the neuron that looks like a tree. It's got the roots. That's what collects the quote-unquote nutrients. In this case, the nutrients are going to be molecules, neurotransmitters. And when you get enough ionic polarization, in other words, when you get enough receptors on receptor sites, the cell body changes its polarization, and now the axon is trying to purge those ions. So the easy way to think about it is when enough serotonin molecules or dopamine molecules or whatever, norepinephrine molecules, when enough of those molecules land on receptor sites, the axon opens up to release the charge. And the charge, not the molecules. A lot of people have gotten this wrong in the past. The molecules are not traveling down the axon. It's not like a hallway, right? The molecules are on receptor sites. And then they get released from receptor sites and they get reabsorbed by the sending neuron. So the molecules have caused this charge to travel down the axon. And the charge reaches the end and causes it to release its molecules. So the direction of a neural impulse goes like this. From the dendrites to the cell body, down the axon, and out through the terminals. So we know this, right? This is the cell body end of the axon, right? It feeds into the dendrites themselves. Right? So we get neuron stimulation. It causes a brief change in electrical charge. If it's strong enough, it produces depolarization and an action potential. And don't overcomplicate that. All that means is that this neuron is being stimulated, and it wants to repolarize. So if it has too many positive ions, it's going to release some of them. That's what repolarization means. So this depolarization produces another action potential a little further along the axon. Gates in the neighboring area are now open, and the charged sodium atoms rush in, and then basically it travels from one segment of the axon to the next until it gets to the very end. So basically what's happening is ions are being released, and then it travels down the axon, and ions are being released, and it travels down the axon, and ions are being released until that whole neuron is back to its resting state. But meanwhile, here's what's happened. That charge has caused the neuron to release its molecules, and now they're out in the spaces of your brain until they get reabsorbed back in, right? So as the action potential continues speedily down the axon, the first section is now completely polarized again. Now, let's get into, so we're going to zoom in here. We're going to zoom into these terminals. At the end of the axon is a terminal. Don't think like airport terminal, think like battery terminal. The positive end of the battery is that little node that's at the end of the battery. So the positive end is where the charge is released. The negative end is where the charge is gathered. So the battery has a negative end, which is like a dendrite, and has a positive end, which is like the terminal. So that battery terminal is where the charge is released, right? So what is a battery if not stored up static electricity? When it releases that charge, it releases it into a current. And if you can concentrate the current, you can power, some device, right? That's what happens. You store up electrical charges, you put them into a circuit, and then it's a power source. It's the same thing that happens in your brain.
So the positive releases it, or
The positive gets released. The positive gets released. And don't overcomplicate how that process works. Just know that basically what happens is a static charge is traveling down the neuron. And as it gets to the end of the neuron, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to say the word shock. It shocks the terminals, and they release their molecules.
when they release it as a positive?
So each one of your neurons produces and stores a molecule. So let's pretend that these molecules are serotonin. So happiness is taking place right now in the brain. So what happens is they're stored in these little sacs. And as the electric charge travels down the axon, again, I'm going to use this metaphor, it shocks them. And it shocks them, and they release atoms. They release molecules. They release these serotonin molecules out into the air. And if this neuron is connected to another nearby neuron, then it's not just that it's releasing molecules. Those molecules are going to find a receptor site. They're going to find a receptor site on the dendrites of another neuron. And it's going to cause depolarization. And the message is going to travel to the next neuron. And those molecules are going to find a receptor site, and it's going to cause depolarization. And then they're going to travel to the next one. And all of this happens at the speed of electricity. One neuron to the next, 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 to the next. And you just know you feel happy. Right? So, serotonin is being released by the sending neuron. And this is important. Don't miss this. The serotonin is going to stay here. It doesn't get absorbed and travel and disappear. In fact, after a period of time, the sending neuron is going to be like, all right, here's the deal. We got to be happy again later. I need that back. Give me back my serotonin molecules. Because it's much easier to recycle molecules than it is for a neuron to make more of it. So each one of your serotonin neurons in the serotonin pathway creates their own serotonin molecules. And they release their own serotonin molecules. And then they reabsorb their own serotonin molecules. So that's called reuptake. Reuptake is the process of the sending neuron reabsorbing back its molecules that it released. So that's why you're not happy all day long. Because at some point those molecules are going to leave their receptor sites and go back home. Now, understanding reuptake is important because now you can understand how antidepressants work. An antidepressant is actually an SSRI. See, they haven't found a pharmaceutical way to synthetically create fake serotonin yet. There's two ways to affect your brain with medicine. You can add a molecule that causes a reaction, or you can block the reuptake of a molecule. So an SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So here's how it works. You ingest a pill. It dissolves in your stomach. It puts an enzyme or a molecule into your bloodstream. When it gets into the brain, it passes through the blood-brain barrier, and now it's bouncing around. And what it does is it lands on the sending neuron. And it blocks the reuptake, the reabsorption of serotonin molecules. So as long as that chemical is in your bloodstream, it's preventing neurons from reabsorbing their serotonin back, which means they stay on receptor sites, which means you have more happiness or more normalcy. Because what happens when your body metabolizes the drug? Well, now that reuptake inhibitor is gone, and the sending neuron absorbs its molecules back, and your mood goes down. So that's how antidepressants work. They block the reuptake of serotonin. They don't act like serotonin. They block the sending neuron from getting its serotonin back, which means the serotonin stays in the synapse longer, it hits receptor sites longer, and it keeps your mood regulated the same. Right? That's what it does. So you have to understand reuptake to understand how medicine affects the brain. Right? If psychoactive medication affects the brain, it does it in one of two ways. It mimics a chemical that your brain produces, or it blocks a chemical that your brain produces. That's the only two ways to pharmaceutically affect the brain. Mimicking a chemical or blocking a chemical. That's the only two things that we can do.
So the neurotransmitter for sleep,
That's melatonin.
melatonin, that one, is going to stay in the synaptic gap until you go to sleep.
It's what's going to cause you to go to sleep. Let's say this was melatonin being released. If melatonin was being released and it landed on its receptor sites, your body would start shutting down and getting tired.
What if you're like trying to stay awake, and then is it just like staying there and making you want to go to sleep?
Yeah, you're fighting against it. Well, if you want to try to stay awake, you do something like drink caffeine, right?
It
And
doesn't go away.
well, it doesn't go away. No, your brain will still produce melatonin when you're tired. In fact, what triggers the release of melatonin is whether or not your brain thinks it's nighttime. So this whole idea of like working at night, you have a part of your hypothalamus, right, that basically it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what the suprachiasmatic nucleus does is determines blue light. Is it daytime or nighttime? So when you put your phone in night mode, what you're doing is convincing your brain that it's not daytime, it's nighttime, right? And it's better for the brain's pineal gland. And basically what happens is you start releasing melatonin. So what prevents the release of melatonin, what inhibits it, let me use a neurological word, what inhibits the release of melatonin is daylight. Daylight entering the eye that goes through the hypothalamus, and it's like it's daytime, we can't produce melatonin. Now you get to a point where you get tired enough that your body's going to shut down. You don't have any energy left. And that's just the organic way to fall asleep. But if you take melatonin, if you ingest melatonin, your brain's not releasing the melatonin. You're adding artificial melatonin to the brain, and it's making you go to sleep. Right? So that's how it works. It's part of that feedback loop. Your eyes are open, daylight gets in, it's blocking the release of melatonin, and you stay awake. Once your brain realizes it's nighttime and it's time to go to sleep, it now releases melatonin, the pineal gland releases melatonin, and you go to sleep. So yes, melatonin is similar to any other. It's a part of the limbic system that produces melatonin. It's called the pineal gland. The pineal gland is what produces melatonin and releases it. Right? So you have to understand synapse, you have to understand reuptake. We talked about neurotransmitters, and I'll tell it to you again. What makes it a neurotransmitter is the fact that it stays in the synapses of neurons. It stays in the nervous system, not the blood. If it circulates through the blood, what is that molecule called? It starts with an H. It's called a hormone. That's the only difference. Hormones are molecules in your bloodstream. Neurotransmitters are molecules in your brain. Now, when you get to med school and stuff like that, you're going to have to know how neurotransmitters affect the release of hormones, right? So what happens when the brain's hypothalamus releases norepinephrine, which gets to the adrenal gland, and it releases adrenaline? It's a feedback loop, right? So you'll learn all of that complex stuff. But for the purposes of psychology, you just know the difference between the blood communication of the endocrine system and the impulse communication of the brain's neurology. So that's synapses. Synapses is the space between two neurons. the space between two neurons. They don't actually physically touch. The reason why molecules land is because of that static charge. Like if you like rub a balloon on your head and you go to touch something, you don't have to make full contact with it for that charge to be released, right? You just have to get close enough. And that's the same thing is true with the dendrites. They grow. Remember we talked about that yesterday? They grow. And as the dendrites grow, they get close enough to other neurons that when a charge is released, they can receive the molecules. So there actually is a microscopic space between. So S for space, S for synapse. That's what it means. All right, so here's the whole process start to finish. The sending neuron is going to have a static charge causing the release of molecules. The receiving neuron is going to have the receptor sites for those molecules, and this process is going to repeat itself. So serotonin released, serotonin received. Serotonin released, serotonin received. Right? It's not the serotonin that's traveling. It's the charge that's traveling. Because after the sending neuron is done releasing molecules, what does it do? It sucks them back up. Reuptake, right? So it's not giving its molecules to this neuron who's giving those molecules to this neuron. Each neuron has their own molecules. They release them, and then they reabsorb them. Yes?
By the sending and receiving neurons, this parts of the same neuron?
Yes.
And one's
Well, no, they're separate. So this neuron has its own dendrites, its own myelinated fatty tissue. It has its own axon and its own terminals. This one, again, it's close. They're not touching. So this is like the foot, right? I'll put the whole slide up there and it'll make sense. Right, so if we zoom in right here, like that is this foot. So they're almost touching. They're almost connected. But again, think like if you wanted to shock somebody with static, you like get this static positive charge. Well, my shoes are rubber, so I'm grounded. But if you rub a balloon, you've changed to like ionization of your body and you are now carrying a static charge. And then you go touch somebody and shock them. That's what's happening with your neurons. They're close enough to each other that when they pass their molecules out, it actually gets absorbed by another neuron. So these are two separate independent neurons that are communicating with each other. Right? That's what they're doing. One neuron is releasing molecules. The other neuron is receiving those molecules and then sending them back. Right? So at the synaptic gap, the space between two neurons, the sending neuron is releasing the molecules. The receiving neuron is receiving them. They're landing on receptor sites that are specifically for that molecule. So let's say that you ingest, like you take an opioid, right? What that does is puts a synthetic form of endorphins into your brain. Well, endorphins are not going to fit into a serotonin pathway. They're not going to fit into a dopamine pathway. They might be close enough to a neuron and bounce around and bounce off of it, but they're not going to cause a reaction. Every pathway has its own specific molecule, its own specific molecular structure, and the receptor sites are specific and unique to that molecule. So serotonin neurons are going to release serotonin molecules, and they can only be received by serotonin neurons. Right? So again, it's like a network of pathways that are all crisscrossing each other. But they don't communicate with other pathways. They only communicate on their own pathway. It's like a chain reaction of serotonin, or a chain reaction of dopamine, or a chain reaction of norepinephrine, a chain reaction of whatever, endorphins. So again, step 1, electric impulses. Release of molecules. Step 2, absorption and reabsorption of molecules. Step 3. So this is a good slide because it has the whole process start to finish if you want to print that slide. Now, let's talk about the major neurotransmitters, and this is where we're going to kind of wrap it up. People tend to confuse the neurotransmitters, so we're going to get into more detail about this tomorrow. There are different molecules in your brain, and they have different functions, and they travel on different pathways. We talked about the serotonin pathway. This is the dopamine pathway. This is what's known as the mesolimbic pathway. Laymen call it the reward pathway in the brain. This is your addiction highway, right there. This is the dopamine system in your brain. It's known as dopaminergic. If something's dopaminergic, it causes the release of dopamine. Your cell phone, well, not your cell phone, but so psychology has been used in the release of the alerts on your phone. The alerts on your phone are dopaminergic. An alert on your phone releases dopamine in the brain. You're being trained, right? So it's not your phone that's dangerous. It's the It's the actions of your phone that manipulate the chemistry of your brain. You can bypass all of that dopamine addiction by simply doing one small thing with all of your apps. And what is that? Turn off your notifications. Turn off your notifications, yes, and you will not be a slave to your phone. So how does addiction happen, right? I'm going to retranslate your question like, what does dopamine do? So dopamine is considered the reward molecule, but here's why it's important that you have a reward molecule. Dopamine is on almost every test, and everybody always confuses what dopamine does. Dopamine is a motivator. I like to use this term. Dopamine is a motivator. So what dopamine does is it records a positive emotional response for a behavior. Right, so think about cavemen. If you were like a cave person back in the day, and you're sitting like crisscross applesauce in a cave. This is the example that I like. Food is not going to come to you. Sex is not going to come to you. Fresh water is not going to come to you. So something in your brain's chemistry has to incentivize you to get up, go out into the world, club a mammal, drag it into the cave and eat it. Or get up, walk into the world, find a female, drag her into the cave, right? Like, so that's got to happen in your dopaminergic system. So what happens is when you participate in a behavior, and that behavior has a positive outcome, dopamine is released in the brain. And the purpose of dopamine is to motivate you to repeat those behaviors again, right? So any positive reaction that you get from a behavior, right? And there are some that have better effects on your brain than others. Like, so the moment of sexual climax, you get a dopamine release in the brain. But you also get an endorphin release in the brain. And endorphins are what make you feel euphoric and light and happy and high, right? They block pain signals, and they make you feel really, really, really excited and relaxed. People confuse that with serotonin. That doesn't mean you're emotionally happy, in a good mood. That also happens, right? Serotonin is released after. Ladies, oxytocin is released at the moment of sexual climax. That's the bonding chemical. You're playing games with your emotions. Why do I say ladies? Because studies show that the male brain does not release oxytocin in nearly the same concentrations at the moment of climax as the female brain does. It's the difference in the female hypothalamus. So at the moment of sexual climax, your brain releases oxytocin. You are now emotionally bonding with the person. That's brain chemistry, right? So those are the things about your dopamine. Dopamine is the behavior itself, the action, right? So let's say like you get an alert on your phone, you open it up, someone has sent you a message. Huzzah, dopamine release, right? So much so that you get these phantom alerts. I felt a buzz. I felt a buzz. No dopamine there, disappointment. That's how addictions happen. Addictions happen because a behavior gives you a positive net response in the brain. And so much so that you need to go back to that behavior repetitively to feel that positive net response. So there's something that's known as the reward prediction error, or RPE. Write down the reward prediction error. This will help you in your score discussion. Psychological addictions happen because of this. The reward prediction error takes like a metaphorical math problem to your behaviors. Let's say that you expect, I'm going to use, Let's say that you're about to participate in a behavior for the first time ever, like going on a roller coaster. So your expectation for how awesome this is about to be might be right here. That's the prediction of the reward. What happens if the excitement exceeds your expectations? That's a positive net gain in happiness. Let me not say happiness because that's going to make you think serotonin. That's a positive net gain in reward in the brain. So here's the problem. The experience has actually exceeded the expectation. But the next time that you go on the roller coaster, you know what to expect. So do you have the same level of exceeding the expectation? No, you do not. It's still a positive experience, but it's not a dramatically better than expected experience. It met your expectation. It was still good. There was still a dopamine release, but there wasn't this massive surprise of awesomeness. So now you see how the addiction happens. Now you have to expect something and be blown away by how much better it was. That's the reward prediction error. What happens if I predict this is going to be equally as novel and awesome as the last time that I did it? And it was fun, but it wasn't as exciting as it was last time. Now you're going to need more of that, or a different behavior. And that's the slippery slope of behavioral addictions. That's how online gambling addictions happen. You're not addicted to the cards or even the money. You're addicted to the risk and the thrill of the behavior. That's how porn addictions happen, right? Those are dopamine addictions in the brain. But yeah, because you have to have that increasing novelty. And that's a scary one because that can affect the intimacy of you in a healthy sexual relationship later on in life, right? If you're training your brain of your sexual expectation based on internet porn, that's problematic, right? That's a good way to end class. Internet porn, right? But that's a dopamine addiction. It's not a chemical addiction. Of course, this doesn't work.